without further ado, let me introduce you to Scott. Big round of applause.
Thank you. See you later. Ni hao. It's fantastic to be here again. This is the 5th time I've done this. One of the challenges that you're going to have today is I'm from Scotland. And you may hear my accent is slightly different to some of your other teachers. So I will do my very best to speak slowly, but if not, we're recording it so you can watch the video later. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Marvellous. Okay. So I'm going to talk about consulting, and I'm going to talk about the reality of consulting, not the consulting that you read about in textbooks. I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you what it's really like to be a business consultant, traveling the world, working with the biggest companies in the world. But before I start, I'm a big user of Twitter, and I'd be absolutely delighted if you would use the hashtag. If you have any questions, you have any pictures or whatever, please use the hashtag. And I promise I will respond. I don't ignore feedback, yeah? So drop me a note, drop me a picture, whatever, and we can have a discussion offline. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what is consulting? Does anyone know what consulting is? Business consulting. You'll have to shout, but does anyone want to have a guess? What is it?
Help companies solve their problems.
Help companies solve their problems. That's a pretty good definition. Anything else? Thank you.
Ask for advice.
Say again?
Ask for advice.
Ask for advice. That's pretty good as well. Anything else? Can I tell you the truth? It's about making lots of money. Consulting firms are there for one reason and one reason only, and that's to make money. They do help companies. They are full of very clever people like you, but they are driven very, very hard on the financial case for making lots and lots of money for the parent company. Do you know any consulting companies? Who have you heard of? Do you know the names of any of them? IBM, Accenture, KPMG, good. Anyone else? EY, good, you pretty much know them, yeah? There's hundreds of them, but there's about, in the UK and in Europe and in most of Asia, there are about maybe 20 big ones. In the rest of the world, there's probably another couple of hundred, but there's a small number of the big consulting businesses. Now, I've worked in a number of them, and what I started to discover was that we're not always that popular with people. They say consultants are just there to tell you, take your watch, tell you the time, and give you it back. Now, that's not entirely fair, but nevertheless, there's a reason why consulting has that reputation out there in the market. It's quite odd though, because if you want to make money in business, probably the best place to go is consulting. You won't make as much money even as a chief executive of an average company as you will as a junior partner in consulting. So consulting is a very lucrative way of making money, of getting your career going, but some of the myths are quite interesting. But are they really myths? And I will talk about that. The one thing I will say though is, I've looked after graduates coming into KPMG, Deloitte, Capgemini, Atos. The one thing I will say is, once you finish your degree or your next degree, that won't get you into full-time consulting. You need much, much more than that. And I'll give you some secrets about that to help you if you're interested in getting into it as a career, because it's a tough in, but once you're in, everything changes. But I will explain that. So what got you here today, or what you get at the end of your degree, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a successful consultant. I worked as an HR director for 20 years before I went into consulting. 20 years. And even then, I didn't go in senior. I was HR director in one of the biggest companies in Europe, and I went in at mid-level. gives you an idea of how tough it is to really get in and get on to the senior levels. But I will touch on how you can get in it and give you some tips on how you could get in even without a lot of experience, because there are ways you can do it. These are the main consultancy businesses that I've worked with and I'm still working with. They are quite different. Certainly, if you look at someone like Atos here, I spent 5 years with Atos in Beijing. I worked on the Beijing Olympics. I worked all over China, bringing together all the technology companies that were involved in that. But they're very much a technology company. If you then look at someone like Deloitte are an accountancy and audit firm who do consulting. So there's a difference between the different consulting companies. And that means those of you who are, and I know a lot of you are interested in finance, there are routes into those companies. The marketeers in the room, there are routes, but there are different routes. And we'll maybe touch on that as we go into the talk later on. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Now, the first thing I'll say to you is, and hopefully the picture translates, there's a lot of rubbish in consulting. And that's because we're pretty clever. One of my mentors used to say, we're smarter than the average bear. Most people working in consulting have got first-class honours degrees, master's degrees, PhDs. They've been directors in main board companies. And because of that, we've got a certain gravitas that companies come along and buy. But the reality is, consulting companies aren't quite as slick often as they appear, and oftentimes they make things up and sell them. So companies like McKinsey, who you might have heard of, Booz Allen, who you might not have heard of, certainly my lot, KPMG, we would just make things up and claim we were probably better than we really were at doing certain things. We got away with it because we were clever, but nevertheless, there is something about it that's quite dark, and again, I will come back to that as we move on. But the one thing that you mustn't go away from today thinking is that there's any such thing as best practice. I actually have a problem with best practice in any discipline, never mind in consulting. I think best practice is a dying idea, all but in very simple things like payroll. I don't believe in best practice. And why do you think that is? Why do you think best practice is fading? Companies are they push themselves on how different they are. And therefore shifting one idea from one company to another, to another, to another is no longer going to work. People won't buy it. And individuals will no longer buy it. So I find now increasingly with my work that companies want me to just look at what might work. So I call it promising practice. That means that quite often, and I do this with all my delegates and all my students, I'll provide information to you that disagrees with what I've taught you. And that's because I work in the most complex area that there is, and that's the human brain. Anyone that tells you that physics is complicated has never dissected a mouse. They say we know about how the cosmos works. We don't know how a mouse works. Biology is much more complex, and the stuff I'm going to talk to you about is rooted in biology, is rooted in behaviours, and that stuff is difficult. So all I can offer you is promising practice. I will not offer best practice. I'll never offer best practice. Maybe in presentation technique, nothing else. Now again, in consulting, I said earlier, it was about making money, and every consultancy company has a process where they look at how do we create opportunities, how do we sell our solutions to those opportunities. So that was someone said solutions. How do we then get into the company who's wanting to buy that solution? And then there's the bit that I am not comfortable with. The final bit is how do we keep making money from that client? And that is part of all certainly the big four in the United Kingdom. Part of their strategy is to, once they get into a client, is to stay in a client. They call this a buying and selling cycle. And everything that we do in consulting is built around that. As I say, I got uncomfortable with it because I feel that it should have been at service. It should have been about providing solutions. It should have been inspiring people. But the consulting model, remember this is about the truth rather than the books. The consulting model is you get in and you keep generating income from that client, whether the client wants it or not. Whether the client wants it or not. So that's one of the real big issues that consulting, as you go into business, you will face, and hopefully armed with this, you can have a better dialogue with the consultancy, whoever it is you're working with. So there's a number of things I'm going to talk about now that are all linked to my experience. And the first one is colleagues. I've worked with about 300 different companies across the world, and the thing that sticks out from all of those companies, and certainly from the consulting perspective, is the quality of the people that you work with in consulting is second to none. The standards are enormous. It's very challenging. Some of the hours are a bit difficult, but the quality of the people are incredible. And you may, in your studies, have come across some thinking around teams and about team working, have you? Yeah? There's a particular model called the high-performing team model, and that talks about when teams are really, really working. Now, these are rare, and in my whole career, I think I've only ever worked in a high-performing team maybe 4 times, and all of those times was in consulting. The quality of the people is astonishing, and the backgrounds that they have is amazing, and I loved that part of it. So this is one of the better bits, and it's not a myth that the standards are extremely high, and that means it's difficult to get in. But as I said earlier, once you're in, things change, and I will talk about that in a minute. The other C is clients. The other thing I found in consulting, and I think it's fair to say almost in every contract I worked on, was that my clients, initially they were wary, they were worried, they were almost scared of me. They didn't know how to work with me. But gradually, when they realised what we were trying to do, which was to help them on the ground, that relationship developed. And I have to say, I'm very fortunate to have some terrific friends from those experiences. So again, although I've said earlier it was about driving cash out of an organisation, the upside, one of the upsides is that the range of clients you work with is incredible. That means nowadays I coach and mentor chief executives all over the world. It means that I'm working with people who maybe were 20 years ago, they would be maybe a middle manager, they would be an accountant or a managing accountant, or they would be an HR director, and they've now moved on. And my relationships with them have moved on. So for some organisations, mainly in the financial sector and the retail sector, I've had more than 20 years work with colleagues who have been in these organisations but have moved on, and we've gone because we became friends and we've moved on through careers. So it's a jolly good way to develop your network via your clients that you get in consulting. The advantage to that, as compared to a normal job, is that I've got, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll see that I have connections from hundreds of companies. Most people have connections from the 2 or 3 companies they've worked in. So in consulting, you get a huge array of contacts and experiences, and I'll explain why that's really important career-wise later. Now, these are some of the companies I've worked with, and it varies a lot. And this is one of the other challenges that you face in consulting, because one day you could be working with IBM, or Apple, or Virgin, or Blue Circle, if you know them in Beijing. And then the next day, you could be working with a local government department. And sometimes in the same day, you can be working with 2 companies that are completely different. And the thing that I took from this, and it's quite interesting because there's not a lot written about this. You may hear about how private industry is much, much better than public sector workers. That's absolute nonsense. I know because I've been there hundreds of times. Some of them might get paid a bit more than them, but actually they're all human beings. And when you get to work in them all, you realise that actually these people in the public sector have got even more pressure on them sometimes than these people in the private sector. So again, don't be fooled by the shiny things you see on YouTube or Vimeo. A lot of these public sector organisations are terrific. And in fact, I would say the 2 best clients I've ever had were the British Ministry of Defence and the CIA. They were the 2 best clients I've ever had. And I've worked with Apple, I've worked with Amazon, I've worked with AI, Watson, I've done all of those, yeah? But the best 2 were 2 public sector organisations. There are reasons for that, I can't go into it just now, but they were certainly my favourite 2 clients over the years. The other thing that happens can be quite weird. We were asked to work with Idris Elba, who I don't know if you know Idris Elba, he's quite a famous actor. And we were asked to bring Idris Elba into a company called Superdry. Have you heard of Superdry? Maybe, yeah. And we spent 6 months working with Idris. And I mean, that was amazing. It was tremendous. And I mean, I've worked with football teams, rugby teams, I've worked with England cricket team. You know, you do get some quite glamorous assignments, but the honest truth is the majority of them are head down, hard work, trying to sort out, as someone said there, issues in the workplace, and it's not always exciting. Sometimes it's really boring, yeah? So you're not working with Idris every day. He's quite interesting. He's a good actor. He's a terrible singer. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is a classic issue in consulting, an absolute classic, and that's dealing with client expectations. They often think that because you're a consultant and you've got your fancy suit on and you've got your degrees and all the rest of it, that you're going to walk in and you can deliver them the best possible service, but they never want to pay for it. So this is what happens. The expectations are very, very high, but often the budgets don't allow you to actually deliver that to that expectation. So one of the things that good consultants do is they are very careful about managing expectations. I'll say that again because it's so important if you're interested in getting into consulting. It is so important that if you're a good consultant, if you want to be a good consultant, that you understand how important it is to manage client expectations, because the client will always want more than the client can afford, or sometimes you can deliver. So that's a really important tip if you think about getting into consulting, and it's all about managing clients. The next thing, and this took me, I think, about maybe 8 months to really understand when I first joined KPMG. And at first it was odd because when I joined, they took me away with all my new colleagues to a beautiful hotel, somewhere very exotic, and they basically told us how to be consultants. They taught us how to be consultants. And I felt a little dehumanized by it. I felt I was becoming a robot because they were just telling me how to behave. But 6 months later, guess who was put in charge of recruiting new consultants? Me. And I completely changed it because I thought, no, I don't want my teams and my colleagues all to be the same. And there are some of the consultancy businesses still do this, but certainly where I have had an influence and have worked, we have changed it. And the way we've changed it is we've made it all about relationships. And we spend best part of 6 months with new recruits. And when I say a new recruit can be 23 or 63. So there isn't any, we don't all recruit, everyone is, just out of university. It can be a specialist who's been working on oil rigs for 40 years, and we need a specialist to go and work in Kuwait for an oil company. We will bring them in, we will train them, but the way we train them is in relationships. Because your technical skills, and this hurts particularly academics sometimes, your technical skills can be taught. So we would bring them in. It didn't really matter if you were a microbiologist or you were a chemist or you were a janitor. If you had the smarts that could pick things up, that was great. But the main thing that we were looking for, certainly in graduate recruitment, was how good were you at relationships. But that is a really tough thing to be good at. Very, very few folk in this room and very few people I've ever met are actually pretty good at managing relationships. And I'm sure my partner Samantha would say I'm not either. So we'll come back to that as well, I suspect. The other thing that I just want you to think about, because if you go into consulting, you can have an edge by knowing about relationships. There's very little in the literature. Most academics are scared of relationships for pretty good reasons, unfortunately. But nevertheless, if you can specialize in that that side of leadership or in business, that can give you an edge in getting into consulting, because they are all looking for relationship specialists. So if you're a marketeer, think about looking at behavioral economics. If you're in finance, think about management accounting rather than financial accounting, because these things give you an edge on other graduates because they do not have the relationship skills. They only have, and I don't mean that with disrespect, but they only have technical skills, which are not always what we need in consulting. The other thing that I call it the sort of the way we're measured, the consultant's capital, is that we were always ahead of the client in terms of data. Now, I said at the beginning, sometimes that data is made up, sometimes that data is perhaps not as robust as it should be, but nevertheless, we had an engine, certainly at Atos, we had an engine where we could create data that could help the client really understand where their problems were and where the challenges were. So again, if you have some training in critical thinking, or you have some training in evidence-based leadership, or in evidence-based HR, or evidence-based marketing, there's an edge in it if you want to get into consulting. So evidence-based thinking is something I would recommend to you if you're interested in getting into consulting. There's an academic in Bath called Rob Binder who's doing some terrific work. I'll send out his details if you want. He's trying really hard to improve the standards in MBA programs and bring more evidence-based thinking into these programs. At the moment, there isn't enough for our industry. So it's something, again, that can give you an edge. Now, I actually spoke about evidence at a TED Talk about 3 years ago. It was in Warwick. And it was an interesting experience because there was 4,000 people there. It was a pretty big talk. But I made some mistakes because I at that time, and my background is I'm a scientist, and my background was that you need evidence for everything. But what I suddenly began to realize just after I did the TED Talk was maybe I also needed to think about the relationships in a different way because you can't measure a lot of that stuff. And again, I talk to companies a lot now about what's called intangibles, rather than just lots and lots of what you must have heard of key performance indicators. Well, I think KPIs, as they're called, are a toxin in contemporary business. There are too many of them that are not serving any purposes. And far too often, people are distracted by constantly looking for return on investment. Now, this is something I'm evangelical about, but companies, when I take them on and I challenge them, nearly always give in because they know they're doing it for other reasons. So again, to give you an edge, think about not only data, think about intangibles like relationships. And I hope you get a chance to watch it. I'm doing another TEDx in Wolverhampton on the 21st of this month. So if you're local and you fancy coming along to see me, I'll be talking about technology that day. Then when I started to train consultants, I tried my best to give them little stories and little ways of remembering what I was trying to teach. And this quote, which is an ancient, it's a 3,000-year-old quote, is one of the most powerful I've ever come across. Now, I don't often use quotes because I find them a bit cheesy, but this one I think is different. Opinions are like nails. The harder you hit them, the deeper inside they go. Any consultant will understand that. Because if you go to a client and you tell that client how poor they are or how inefficient they are, they immediately become defensive. In psychology, we call it the backfire effect, but they become negative. They become difficult to work with. So again, as a consultant, you've got to learn these nuances and how to deal with people who you might not agree with. So for example, you may have heard of Brexit. Yeah? One of the things I would love to see, not only with Brexit, but with politics generally, is that people thought like that in the House of Commons. So rather than clashing with one another, they actually tried to understand one another. I think I'm dreaming rather than it's ever going to happen, but nevertheless, I would love to see that because we know from psychology that by being adversarial, all you do is make things worse. So if you are abusive and aggressive towards President Trump, he just becomes more Trumpy. Yeah? You can't use aggression to change people. It doesn't work. And this is something you learn quite early on in consulting. And actually, if you become adversarial in consulting, you won't be in consulting very long. You will be off. The other area that I would seriously urge you to think about, and I know you're all, under 25 or nearly all under 25, storytelling is something that I think should be on the school curriculum. I think it should be embedded in every organisation's onboarding practice. But I think it's even more important than that for you. And what I say when I do a keynote speech on this, and I call it "Let Your Life Speak." Because the evidence is that and a wonderful science fiction writer called Ursula Le Guin said this, stories are our operating system. They are the best manual we have. And when I tell story, I was speaking at an event last night, and they were a pretty boring bunch of professionals. But I was telling stories to them, and they were crying. And immediately you resonate with their feelings, and the boring goes away. The armour comes down, and they start to interact with you. And again, this is where, unfortunately, a lot of consultants, an awful lot of chief executives, and many academics are really poor storytellers. So again, if you want an edge, think about storytelling. Think about your life, your parents' life, your experiences of working in different countries, moving. That's important when you're trying to get someone to resonate with you in consulting. And that, to me, is my consulting capital. It's my storytelling that means I'm a busy guy. Not my knowledge of consulting, not my knowledge of business, technology, biology, psychology, none of that. It's got to do with storytelling. So just think about that. How good a storyteller are you? And if you're not any good, you should start thinking about it. Because I honestly believe it's a critical skill for the future, and I know it's not taught in our schools. The next thing, it's another C, create. This is something that's a bit more grey, a bit more unclear. But as you come in as a consultant, you'll find that the senior people will say, okay, we've got a problem, as you said, sir, we'll be asked to solve an issue at work, and you'll be asked to develop something, you'll be asked to create a solution. Now this at first is extremely difficult, because all you'll have in your back pocket will be your Cotter change models and all your textbook models that you get taught at university. Now, they are really useful. But someone once said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And a lot of those models are quite useful. So as a basis, you're luckier than a lot of people who have worked that have never been to university, because they've not got any of that thinking in them. However, again, an edge for you getting into business is being able to bring together thinking from different disciplines and create a solution for that client that at least feels unique. At least feels unique. Because what will happen in many consultancies is they will take your idea, they'll sell it to one client, then they'll sell it to another client, then they'll sell it to another client until people get sick of it, then they'll start again. But anyway, the value in it for you is to know that being creative is actually really, really important in the consulting world. Clients love a bit of creativity. Now, this is the sort of thing that I used to produce. I don't expect you to be able to read it, and to be honest, I don't want you to read it, because I was a young guy when I did this, but this was a model that we used to help companies understand how we could break down change and help them transform the businesses. So that's the sort of thing that classically you'd be asked to work on. Now, of course, it's not just one slide. It was probably about 500 slides. It was probably a book. In fact, it is a book. And that's a change methodology, we would call it. And that was the sort of thing I was asked to do when I first joined consulting. Despite the fact, and it's slightly odd, because my background, I used to work in pathology. I used to cut up dead bodies. And then I was being asked to do change programs in companies. So my best line, it probably doesn't translate, was I went from human remains to human resources, which was a slightly odd transition. But nevertheless, they found that my brain was able to do it, and I was surprised, probably as much as they were, that I could do it. But there is a but. That's the but. Back to relationships. It doesn't matter how good your model is, how good your approach is, how good your technology is, if people don't listen to you. And this is where, again, it's quite interesting. If you look at the sort of the gold standard consultants like McKinsey and Booz Allen, they are famous for being strategy consultants. They are equally as famous in the consulting world as being terrible delivery consultants. They are awful at it. They can't do anything on the ground. They can't do any real work. They're only good at thinking. Now that's good. They're good at thinking. That's their market. But they often try to deliver things as well, to make change happen. They are really poor at it. That's because they don't understand the importance of relationships. So there's a big distinction there between a KPMG, an Atos, than there is to a Booz Allen or a McKinsey, in that KPMG and Atos can deliver things. They they often feed off McKinsey. McKinsey will try and do something, make a mess of it, and then will come KPMG or Atos and fix it. That's a common consulting model across the world. It's not just in the United Kingdom or China. I'm going to give you, this is fun, but this is probably the most important part of my speech. In fact, I would go as far to say that this is more important than anything you've done at university so far. This is why companies go down all over the world. This simple exercise sums it up. Do you trust me? Not sure, yeah? A little bit. Can you trust me for 5 seconds? I'm going to stay on the stage, all right? 5 seconds. What I would like you to do, and I'm really excited about doing this with you because you're all from different backgrounds, so this is good for me as well. Close your eyes. Please close your eyes. Thank you. Marvellous. Well done. Close your eyes. Come on, close your eyes. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Come on, trust me for a minute. Close your eyes. I want you to imagine something in your head. I want you to imagine something and try and see it in your mind. I want you to imagine a dog. So you can see a dog in your mind. A dog, D-O-G. I'm trying. And I would like you to put that dog into a yard, Y-A-R-D. So in your mind, you've got a dog in a yard. Open your eyes. Thank you. That is the most important exercise you will ever do in a lecture theatre once you get into business, because that is the reason why most companies go down. And I'll explain why. Most of you, if you understood my accent, would have gone to something in your mind that you knew already. So it would be your dog, your mum and dad's dog, perhaps a television or cartoon dog, but most of you would have done that. There's maybe in the room, there's 400 of you, so maybe 10 of you couldn't do the exercise at all because you can't visualise. Then the word yard. Now the word yard means different things in different countries. So for example, in the United Kingdom, a yard is an industrial thing. It's like got diggers and trucks and digging holes and, messy. In the United States, a yard is a garden. So that immediately creates, in most groups, confusion. Even that simple exercise creates confusion. With those simple words, everyone in the room has seen something different, but something from their own experience. Some people don't. There's always a few don't, but most people do. When you go into industry, dog in the yard is everything. Because what you're trying to do is make sure everyone sees things like you do. Or the chief executive, she sees everything, or she pushes down into the company a message that everyone understands. And I can tell you from my experience across the world, I can't name one company that's really good at that. They put a word out and they'll say something like, one of my favourites is strategy. No one knows what strategy means. I mean, you talk to like an HR professional and you say, what's your ambition? And they say, I want to be a strategic HR business partner. And you get 100 of them in the room, and I've done it, get 100 of them in the room and get them to write down what they mean by strategy. Every single one of them writes something different down. It is not clear. Now, as you become an executive and as you become someone, in the business world, it's so good if you can spend time thinking about, am I sure I understand what she means by strategy is the same as what I understand? And if you do that, not only will you help you will help your boss. Because often, have you heard of SAP, the German technology company? SAP, doesn't matter if you haven't. I was running a leadership program for SAP in Cologne, in Germany, and I was sitting with the board, so the chief executive, HR director, finance director, the classic board, and I asked them what SAP stood for. Half of them didn't know. Half of them didn't know what their own company name meant because they're too shy to ask. Don't be shy to ask, because you know what happens if you ask what something means? Everyone else in the room are going, oh, thank goodness for that. So you're helping everybody else. So again, a key tip, and this is strategic. I've spent 12 months with a particular retailer trying to get them clear on what their dog in the yard is or was, and they still can't get it right. It's that difficult. That's where I laugh at company values and company strategy, because oftentimes the reality is, if I drew a line a mile round this university and I went into any business, they would all have pretty much the same values. You know, honesty, integrity, communication, continuous learning. But the minute you start to ask them what it means, they haven't got a clue. And even when they've had a good team working on it, they haven't disseminated it in a dog-in-the-yard way. So please, if you don't remember anything else from my speech, apart from my cool shirt, is try and remember that dog-in-the-yard exercise. It is so powerful in reality. And I think it removes, as Pico Iyer, one of the best travel writers I think in the world, said, it removes the cap from other people's perception of their organisation and sometimes of you. Very, very powerful. So back into practical stuff. The other stuff that you'll get involved in consulting can be quite interesting. Some of it can be quite, as I said earlier, quite boring. And there is a bit of a balance in consulting between what I've called doing and delivery, because oftentimes you'll find yourself in a company where you might be the only consultant working there. But the great thing about consulting, and it is different to any other industry, is that you are never alone. So when I had a team, when I worked in the consulting world, I had a team of over 100 people. And if any one of them was working in a business and they had a problem, they had 99 people behind them. And it didn't matter who was senior, because your job as a consultant was to drive value out for that company and make more money for our consultancy business. So that's, again, a difference. You've got to learn how to ask for help. Because if you don't ask for help in consulting and you make a mistake, you lose your job. You've got to put your hand up and say, I don't know how to do it. Now, human beings are not very good at that. We're not good at asking for help. And you as a junior person going in, it's quite scary asking for help. But nevertheless, I promise you, if you go into consulting and you want an edge, take off your armour. Say, I don't know what I'm doing. That is a positive behaviour in consulting. Sometimes for the wrong reasons, but most of the time they want you to succeed, and that's good for your career. So try not to forget that. For goodness sake, don't fall into the bad presentation technique. The world of presentation is changing. We do not do this anymore. Big, heavy packs full of words are not acceptable anymore. If you can understand my pack without me speaking, I'm not delivering a presentation, I'm delivering a book. Most of the presentation skills courses around are terrible. You must think about your audience. You'll notice I use nearly all pictures. That helps you. You don't speak the same language as me, most of you, but some of the pictures are helping, I hope. That's the way you've got to think. Don't use words, use pictures. And even better than that, don't use it at all, just use stories. But that's not appropriate for today. Now, I've mentioned about selling before and how important it is. I have a hope here, and this is more a hope than an experience. I have a hope that that's going to change. And I'm seeing it again, second time round, where the big consultancy companies are in trouble because they're overselling. Auditors are getting caught out for selling consulting once again. And I hope that in the next 5 years, and it's that short, that the consulting world is going to change its perspective on selling, and it's going to go more towards what you said at the front, providing a service. And if that happens, I might get more interested in going back again. But nevertheless, for me, it's still about selling. However, I think it could change. Dan Pink, who is a journalist and a speechwriter. So he comes at it from an unusual angle. He wrote that book a few years ago now, and I think it's pretty good as a pop book. It's a good introduction to how selling can be reframed. So I recommend that book to you if you're interested in looking at where it's going. Now this, for me, was the bit that changed my life. I joined KPMG as an HR professional. I knew about HR, human resources. I knew about change, but that was basically it. And on my first day, I told you I went off to some fancy hotel somewhere in Europe. They said to me, "What else can you do?" And I was like, "I can cut dead bodies up. I'm not sure what else I can do." So they introduced you at that point to what they call the T model. And the T model is this. I touched on this earlier. They will say, okay, you will have a deep specialism in your consulting career. So mine was obviously HR and transformation change. But you must also have other skills that companies are willing to purchase. So you're given about a year to do this. You're given a year to find out what else you might be interested in. So I actually ended up doing procurement, which I'd never even heard of, to be honest. I ended up doing procurement, and the other one I did was technology. And then what a consulting business will do is they will invest in your development so you can get up to speed in both of those disciplines. And I think that's where I learned that going to university in your 20s is probably not the right age to go to university, because I was picking this stuff up in my 30s and I flew through it. And I loved it and I was very passionate about it. So my T now is HR, transformation and change, technology and procurement. And I speak at as many procurement conferences as I do HR and technology conferences now. So this is a great thing you will find if you go into consulting. They nurture capabilities that you may not know that you have. And let me give you a little quote on this that, again, I think is beautiful. And this, again, really helps when you're writing strategy in organizations. This is after an educationalist called Ken Robinson. And he said, human resources are oftentimes like natural resources. Sometimes you've got to dig deep to find them. Human resources are oftentimes like natural resources. Sometimes you've got to dig deep to find them. And as someone who trained consultants to be consultants, I saw it as my job to give them the tools to find out what their real talents were. And that is something I would again say, if you're looking for a career that will really get you to flourish, consulting could be the place, because you get the opportunity to try different things out that you might never have thought you would ever work in. I've even worked in women's underwear once, which is quite bizarre, but I did. And you get into such weird and wacky areas. It's very interesting and very challenging as far as capability is concerned. But that leads me to a question. And I'd like to ask everybody in the room this, just in your head though. For whom do you work? For whom do you work? Now at the moment, most of you don't. Most of your students, lecturers, for whom do you work? The answer to that question, if you got what I just said about capability, is I don't work for the University of Birmingham. I don't work for KPMG or Atos or Deloitte or Accenture or PwC. I work for myself. And if you understand that in consulting, your career will go woof, because it's people who get that, who spend a ridiculous amount of time and money on their own development. They're the ones that progress. And again, unlike an industry, in what I call proper jobs, you're actually seriously rewarded for continually developing yourself. It's seen as a very, very powerful capability in the consulting world. I'm an absolute addict. I read 3 books a week. I go on retreats 4 or 5 times a year. I am absolutely fully invested in my own capability development, and you are never finished. Anyone who thinks they're finished would get sacked in a consulting business. It's not good enough for a managing partner or even a chief executive to say they're finished. She will not get away with that. Her chair will say, no, you've got to keep going and keep going up. And in consulting, that's a good thing about consulting. I don't think that's a bad thing. And they will invest in you. I got 3 degrees as a consequence of working in consulting. 3 degrees. And you know how expensive it is to get a degree. Yeah, they pay for it because they want you to get that learning, they want you to get that capability that you can then take into clients. And that can help you do this, because with those tools and those techniques, you get quite fleet of foot, you get quite flexible. I mean, I can talk about pretty much anything these days. Give me a topic, I'll talk about it. Because you get to that point where you become almost saturated. But the other thing I've always realised is, and this is where, again, one of my warning signs for a poor consultant is that they are certain. They tell me they know the answer to anything. Anyone who thinks like that does not know the answer. They think they know the answer, but they're not well enough experienced to know that there are so many variables that the best you can ever offer is promising practice. Now, this is one of the questions my mentor asked me at KPMG and then latterly at Atos. She said, Scott, what are you going to be famous for? Because again, in consulting, what will happen is, and it's completely different to any other industry, if you do a good job in consulting, but no one sees you. So say you're a data processor, or you're a marketing analyst, or a financial accountant. If all you do is world-class accounts and world-class marketing, you will not get promoted. You've got to put your head above the parapet. You've got to be noticed in the business to get promoted. Now, some people think that's unfair. I probably think it is unfair. But in the consulting world, that's how it works. So my mentor asked me, what will you become famous for? And I became very famous for being a presenter. And I became the go-to guy to do keynote speaking, to do client pitches, and I had never spoken in my life before until I went into consulting. And I became the guy that did all the speaking. And you have to find what you're really, really good at. And sometimes it might be something that you don't think could add value to that company. Oftentimes you'd be very surprised in what came up. Susan Sontag, one of the great journalists in the 60s and the 70s, said, I am only interested in people who are engaged in lifelong transformation. Well, I can assure you in consulting, that's true. They will follow you, they will develop you, they will look after you if you are engaged in lifelong transformation. And the other thing that I found, and this is quite nice, is that clients like it too. They like to see that you're pushing yourself all the time. They like to see that you're trying to become better. Now, there's a dark side to consulting that I'd just like to touch on before we finish. You spend your time traveling around the world. It sounds quite sexy. It sounds quite exciting. It isn't. It's exhausting. I was working in Beijing on a Tuesday with a cement company, Blue Circle. And I got a call from my managing partner saying, I need you to come and present to Carphone Warehouse, which is an old telephone company in the UK, and I need you to do it tomorrow, and I need you to prepare for that presentation. So I had to tell my client in Beijing, sorry, I've got to go to the United Kingdom. I got on an aircraft, I wrote my presentation in the aircraft, I landed in London, there was a car waiting for me, I got into the car, I drove to Carphone Warehouse, I presented, got back in the car and back to Beijing, and I was in the office at 8 o'clock the next morning. That happens all the time. That's one of the pressures that you get. And that, I have to say, is not good for your health. You're drinking, you're eating. I was about this size when I stopped consulting. The other thing that is very common in consulting is that marriage doesn't work. There are very, very few married consultants. They might join the company married, they often don't finish married. In my practice, there was 400 of us, I think it was 80% were divorced. That's because you're traveling so much. So you're earning good money, but it's not good for your relationships. And there's a McKinsey partner put it rather beautifully. So again, if you go into consulting, be aware of this. I am now married to another consultant, and that works perfectly because we understand the lifestyle. But that is a hard truth you will not get in any of the consulting books. But the reality is it damages your personal life if you let it. I let it and I lost my first marriage. So I know it hurt and it was terrible. Yeah, so think about it. If you go into consulting, it can really, really damage your relationships at home. The other thing to be as a consultant is current. You've got to know what's happening today. That means that even good books like these books, that I do recommend if you want to read some books on this, the average book is about 3 years out of date. The average article in the research media, in the academic media, is a year out of date, or a year and a half now in some journals, out of date. So keeping up to speed with what's really happening is very, very difficult. However, a consultant has got an edge on that because you're working with the people oftentimes who are having the new thinking. So I was working in IBM Watson before people had heard of Watson. You may not have heard of it, but it's one of the big so-called artificial intelligence machines that IBM run. So you actually get ahead of the game by working with your clients. But do not think that you're going to get new thinking out of Harvard Business Review or books. You won't. You'll get slightly old thinking, but nevertheless it could be helpful, but the real new thinking is from your clients. So bear that in mind if you go into consulting. Can give you a real edge. The other thing that I found difficult personally, it's not my personality, is complexity in consulting. It's very, very difficult. Because 1 minute, as I say, you could be working in Beijing on a cement company or a chemical company. The next day, you can be working, or the same day, you can be working with a telecoms company. And that evening, you can be doing an after-dinner speech in a gentleman's club in London, literally. So that complexity is quite often difficult to manage. And I think, again, if I was going into it again, and I'm not going to go back into it again, but if I was going into it again, I think I'd be the fittest consultant in the world. Because I think your health, your well-being, your mental health is seriously important if you decide to go into consulting. It is not the same as other jobs. Another one that's very important, and this is quite difficult for a lot of people to really understand. There's a Scottish saying, well, I say it in Scottish. If you flee with a cross, you get shot with a cross. That's how I really speak. If you fly with the crows, you get shot with the crows. And that means that if you spend your time with people who are, you will be seen as one of them. You have to be very, very careful about that. Because in consulting, you're only as good as your last job, and you've got to manage that network. It's very, very important. I'm going to skip that one. Does anyone know what serendipity means? Probably not. Serendipity means luck. And in consulting, you can get very lucky if you understand what I've just said about thinking about who you work with, because the evidence is, and they call it in the academic world, combinational creativity. If you work with different people, you can become lucky. And let me show you how I describe this to my clients. I use an elephant. This is a story that some of you may well be familiar with. It's a myth about a town in Persia where everyone was blind. And one day, this animal came into the town and they said, "What is it? Describe it to us." 5 people from the blind committee came to see the elephant. And this is what they did. The first one got the tail and felt the tail and thought, it's long, it's soft at the end. It might be a snake. It might be a rope. The second one felt a leg and thought, it's round, it's hard, a tree. The next one looked at its tummy, its stomach, and thought, it's big, it's huge and hard, it's a wall. And then another one looked at the tusk. It's hard, it's sharp, it's a spear. And the final one, she felt the trunk and she thought, it's round, but it's got a hole in it. It's a pipe. In consulting, you need to become someone who sees the whole elephant. And the only way you do that is by working across disciplines. An accountant never sees the whole business. A marketeer never sees the whole business. A chief executive never sees the whole business. And consultants are all about seeing the whole business. And if you've listened to what I've said today, in terms of capability, etc., that can really help you see the whole business. And that gives you an edge. And there's a biological principle that has been championed by a chap called E.O. Wilson for decades. and it's called consilience. And consilience is about something is more likely to be true if it's been demonstrated in different disciplines. And consulting is about consilience. That's what we do in consulting. And my stories and my work is all embedded in that image, because I talk about science, Scotland, writing, consulting, music, fitness, rugby, speaking, laughing, whatever. I do all of those things when I'm speaking, because that helps my client see the elephant. So again, don't be pigeonholed, particularly if you go into consulting. Don't be pigeonholed as just an accountant, just a marketeer, just a lecturer. There is more to you than that, than one role. I'm going to end with a little secret. And this again, thanks to Harry Potter. One of the other things that will set you apart in consulting is, don't be one of these. Do you know what that is? A Dementor. What did Dementors do in Harry Potter? They suck the life out of you. What's the cure for a Dementor's kiss? No! It's not the Patronus. No, that scares them away. The cure for the Dementor's kiss is chocolate. So keep chocolate in your business. And if someone comes in like that, give them a piece of chocolate and tell them to cheer up. Don't go America smile, smile. Don't do that. But always keep your spirits up. Now, I hope you've enjoyed that. You'll get a pack from me with some suggested reading. These books are all good. They're all short, easy to read. So I hope you have a look at these. I've got some details here which you will get in the pack. I've got a video series that I've just launched. Now, if you get your phones out, there you go. Get your phone out. That'll take you right to my YouTube channel. And it'll give you some of the thinking that I've been working on in the last 5 years. Been working with Charlie here, making videos for the last year. I hope you find it interesting. I'm going to say one more thing. And this is a lesson that I learned in consulting. Hold on. One more thing. One more thing. One of the other things consultants need to know and appreciate is that every time you work with a client, you should be creating collateral. Collateral at every step. So can I make some collateral with you? Yeah? Right. Look, I've got one of these. A selfie stick. I want a picture. Right? I take this job very seriously. Right. Now I want you to go, ooh, right? Or cheer at least. Right. There you go. Right. 1, 2, 3, 1. Go on. Thank you very much. Now, we're short of time, but does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Any questions? Yeah. Sorry, hold on.
It is that for those consultants, they are very professional to serve their clients. But, but most time, the clients who apply those consultants is company themselves. How those consultants can assess their results?
Okay. That question was, how do consultancies help themselves? Why don't the companies help themselves? Yeah? The simple fact is that most companies do not have that capability. They don't have the depth of experience, because in consulting, the working with different companies gives you the elephant. Most companies don't get that. Most companies, you will spend your entire career working in little bits of the business. Very few people have worked in different disciplines. So the gold from consulting is, I can take an idea that I've found in chemistry and I can use that in retail. Or I can take an idea I've got from retail and I can use that in technology. Very few folk outside consulting can do that. That's that's one of the gold stars from consultancy. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure meeting you all. Good night.